We continue Nightline's federal budget special now, and it's time to find out how the opposition rates Wayne Swan's big night. So back to Laurie Oakes again, and in the hot seat, it's Shadow Treasurer Malcolm Turnbull.
Mr Turnbull, welcome. This seems to be being greeted as a fairly responsible Conservative budget. That's not the way you see it.
Well, it's an inflationary budget. It's high taxing and it's high spending. It increases taxes on a whole range of things that are in the CPI, alcohol, cars, private health insurance. It'll increase the price of private health insurance. And of course it spends more. Mr Swan was saying for months, as you know, to you and to everybody else that he was going to make massive cuts in spending. He's actually spending more.
Well, you say it's high taxing, high spending, but there are spending cuts of $7 billion in the budget, new spending of only $5 billion. Real government spending only increases by 1.1%, which I think is slower than any time in a decade. How can you claim it's a high taxing?
Well, Laurie, what they've done is they've cut spending on Howard government programs and then added much higher levels of spending on their own programs. So net spending, which is the only thing that matters, has actually increased. Now, the rate of increase is not as high as it's been in some years past, but if you go forward a couple of years into their estimates, they're forecasting a very high increase in spending in 2009, 2010. So the bottom line is, Mr Swan said he was going to slash spending to drive down inflation. He's increased spending. He said he was going to cut taxes. He delivered Peter Costello's tax cuts. He was a good postman, but then he added some tax increases of his own.
Well, you've used the phrase high taxing budget, but in fact the proportion of tax as a share of GDP is down from 24.7% according to the budget papers to 23.8%.
Well, that's a tribute to the increase in the GDP. I mean, the level of taxes in dollar terms has increased, and of course they've added new taxes on motor cars, on alcohol. I mean, this tax on ready-to-drinks, on so-called Alco-Pop drinks, is going to deliver $3.1 billion over the forward estimates. And when you look at the forecast, Laurie, in the budget papers, it's clear that the Treasury thinks people are far from drinking less of these drinks. People are going to be drinking more of them.
Now, you say, I think, that you've got analysis that shows that Wayne Swan's new and increased taxes will add, 0.4% to the CPI.
Well, that's some preliminary economic modelling. Obviously, we've only had the budget for a short time, and that's why we'd like Mr Swan, with the full resources of the Treasury and months to work on this, to tell us exactly what they say the inflationary consequences of his budget is going to be.
But Brendan Nelson uses the figure 0.25% of the CPI. Who's right?
Well, there's 0.4% was the number that was produced. I can't...
We're in a different budget.
No. We're all together. There's a lot of figures flying around tonight, Laurie, so...
Is that embarrassing?
I'm not embarrassed at all.
Now, what about the means testing of things like the baby bonus, the family tax benefit Part B? Do you now accept that that's a good idea?
Look, as far as family tax benefit B is concerned, we're going to have a good look at that. That is a welfare payment, a social welfare type of payment. Family tax benefit A, of course, is means tested, and family tax benefit B has always been means tested on the spouse's income. So it's always been partly means tested. The baby bonus is in a separate category. The view of the previous government and our view as a party has been that this was sending a universal social message, and it was about the importance of childbearing and children, and it was valuable for it to be a universal payment. Now, what they're proposing, what Labor is proposing, will result in a relatively small saving, and indeed a big part of that saving will not come from the means testing, but from the fact that instead of the baby bonus being paid in one lump, it'll be spread out over 13 fortnightly payments. So,
but is that not that small a saving? It's something like $300 million over the forward estimate.
No, it's about, in a full year, it's about $100 million, and around a third of that will come from the changes in the payment schedule, so that's got nothing to do with means testing.
But it's 300 over the forward estimates. It's not to be sneezed at.
No, Laurie, it is not to be sneezed at all, but you've got to bear in mind that this is a payment of $5,000 to around 300,000 mothers, so that's $1.5 billion. So it's relative to the total amount, it is not a huge saving. It's really an issue of principle. Labor has a different view about the baby bonus to what we had. What really matters now is to look at how this baby bonus will work. Is it fair to stretch it out over 13 fortnightly payments? Is it fair to be in a position where if a family earns $1 more than $75,000 in the 6 months after the birth of the baby, they get nothing? If they earn $75,000 or less, they get $5,000. That seems a pretty drastic approach. There's no provision in the budget papers for it to be tapered off. It seems a very ill-conceived sort of means test. If you're going to have a means test, it should be structured in a more careful and intelligent way.
Is there anything about this budget that you like?
Well, look, I like the fact that we've got strong economic growth. I like the fact that we've got a big surplus. Peter Costello had a big surplus too. I mean, the coalition ran big surpluses for years. I'm all in favour of strong economic growth, and that has been delivered. We like the tax cuts because they were our tax cuts. What I'm astonished by, Laurie, is that Wayne Swan for months has been saying that he was going to make big swinging cuts in spending. Now, I actually believed him. I was worried that he was going to make cuts that would be too big and to do damage to our economy. In fact, he's increased spending.
In fact, he now describes it as a mild tightening.
I know, it's extraordinary. This was going to be pain for all, a horror budget, and then what happened? What happened? But wasn't he in the... Did Lindsay Tanner actually write the budget and not tell Wayne Swan about it? It's really hard to know.
Final question. What about the Building Australia Fund? Do you approve of that?
I really approve of investing in Australia, but I think this fund, there's just not enough detail about it. This is $20 billion of Australians' savings. That's what it represents. Wayne Swan is putting it into a fund with infrastructure written on it. He has not told us what type of infrastructure. He hasn't said what economic return, what financial return this fund will get from the infrastructure it invests in. We don't know whether it will get a financial rate of return, a reasonable return, or whether it will just be used to subsidise inefficient Labor state government utilities in water or energy or transport. I mean, he's written himself a blank cheque, and I can tell you as a businessman, a former businessman, if you went out into the public markets and said, give me a few $1 billion for an infrastructure fund, but I'm not going to tell you what our investment approach is going to be, you'd be laughed at. Now, Wayne Swan is taking us all for mugs. There is just not enough detail about this. He talks about discipline. Laurie, there's no discipline.
We thank you.
Thank you.
Laurie Oakes there with Shadow Treasurer Malcolm